Imagine walking through the marble halls of ancient Rome, the mighty empire we're so used to glorifying in history books. We think of towering aqueducts, shining temples, legal codes that shaped the modern world, and generals who conquered vast lands. But behind all that grandeur was a hidden world that Rome rarely wanted remembered. A world not of emperors or senators but of boys, young men stripped of their freedom, forced into roles no human should ever have to endure. These weren't gladiators fighting for their lives in arenas, nor were they household slaves serving wine or cleaning villas. These were concubines, male companions taken by Rome's wealthy and powerful. Their youth, their beauty, and their vulnerability became commodities in a system where pleasure for the elite meant suffering for the powerless. And the truth of their lives reveals a side of Rome that completely shatters the romantic image we often carry of this so-called civilized empire. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we can explore these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by nothing but our shared curiosity for the past. Now, let's open the doors to this darker Rome. In Roman society, relationships of intimacy and companionship didn't fit neatly into the categories we think of today. For them, everything was about hierarchy, about who had power and who didn't. Consent as we understand it now was almost irrelevant. The highest-born men could take what they wanted, and those at the bottom, especially enslaved boys, had no choice but to give it. These concubines were often barely into their teens. Many were captured from conquered lands, others born into slavery, some even sold by desperate families crushed under debt. They weren't chosen for intelligence, skill, or strength, they were chosen because of how they looked. In the eyes of their Roman masters, their beauty was their curse. The process of selection was chilling. Imagine a marketplace buzzing with activity. On one side, spices, wine, silks. On the other, human beings. Wealthy Romans would walk through rows of terrified boys, inspecting their faces, their bodies, their posture, debating their value like livestock. Greek boys were especially prized for their reputation of refinement and education. Germanic boys were valued for their pale skin and strong builds. Each body was a transaction. Each future, a commodity. Once purchased, these boys stepped into a life where their identity vanished. They became possessions, expected to anticipate every desire, to appear grateful for every demand, to play the part of willing participants even as their own sense of self was torn apart. Their smiles were performances, their compliance, a survival strategy. And the psychological toll of that cannot be overstated. Imagine being forced, night after night, to not only endure what violated your dignity, but to do so while pretending to enjoy it. Imagine knowing that your survival depended not just on obedience, but on convincing your master that you were happy in your chains. Some masters lavished their concubines with silk robes, golden jewelry, even education. They were dressed in beauty, sometimes taught to read and write, or schooled in music and philosophy. But this kindness was poisoned. The gifts came with chains, reminding them that everything they had, from food to clothes to knowledge, was conditional. They were pampered only so long as they remained pleasing. Others weren't so fortunate. Many lived in conditions little better than ordinary slaves, summoned only when their master desired them, then discarded into bare quarters with no privacy, no possessions, no hope. And in either case, the law offered them nothing. Roman law recognized citizens. It even gave some protections to slaves. But male concubines? They lived in a legal shadow, an in-between space where their master's whims mattered more than any right or recognition. This meant they couldn't complain. They couldn't seek protection. They couldn't form true bonds of love or friendship without fear of punishment. Even their attempts at small kindnesses toward one another could be weaponized. Some masters deliberately isolated their concubines, forbidding friendships within the household. Others pitted them against each other, creating constant competition. Imagine being forced into rivalry with the only people who could understand your pain, told that if you lost your master's favor, you might lose everything. Education, too, was twisted into another chain. While many concubines were taught poetry, philosophy, and conversation, it wasn't for their benefit. It was to make them more entertaining for their owners, to sharpen them into ornaments of wit and charm that could amuse at banquets or pass long evenings in dialogue. They were expected to know art and literature, but never for themselves, always for another's pleasure. Their bodies, too, were controlled with ruthless precision. Concubines were often forced to maintain diets, exercise routines, and grooming regimens that kept them youthful and appealing. Some were subjected to cosmetic treatments or even crude surgeries to meet their master's preferences. These were performed without modern medicine, making them painful, dangerous, and deeply humiliating. Dressed in silk, glittering with jewels, they might look like princes, but those adornments were collars, not crowns. A master's pride in how beautifully he could present his concubine only underscored the fact that he owned him. And the irony ran deeper still. Some concubines traveled across the empire with their masters, accompanying them to villas or even other provinces. To outsiders it might have looked like privilege, seeing new lands, attending grand events. But to the concubine, it was just another cage. They were portable property, expected to perform the same role wherever they were carried. Inside the household, their status remained ambiguous. To free members of the family, they were temporary amusements, not people. To other slaves, they might seem shameful or compromised. They were caught in a strange in-between, belonging nowhere, respected by no one. But perhaps the most tragic consequence was what happened to the families left behind. A boy taken as a concubine vanished from his community. His parents might never know his fate, whether he was alive, whether he suffered, whether he remembered them at all. Some families were forced to sell their sons into this life to pay debts, making a sacrifice that broke them forever. For those boys, the burden of knowing they had been traded for survival must have been unbearable. And when they tried to resist, escape attempts were rare but desperate. Those who tried often faced brutal punishments, public beatings, humiliations, even execution. The message was always the same: your body is not your own. Even death could be denied them. Some concubines tried to take their own lives rather than endure further torment, but masters saw them as investments too valuable to lose. Constant supervision, locked quarters, removal of anything sharp, suicide itself became a stolen freedom. And in Rome the gods had no comfort for them. While citizens prayed to Jupiter for justice or Mars for victory, these boys were left out. They were invisible in both law and faith, shadows in a city of marble. Some clung to foreign cults or secret rituals, but even that was dangerous, as their masters sought to control not only their bodies but their souls. The empire's appetite created a marketplace that made all this possible. The more the elites demanded beautiful companions, the more traders supplied them. Boys became commodities traded across the Mediterranean, fueling an economy of suffering. And the system grew so large, so entrenched, that even schools were established. Training institutions where boys were conditioned to be perfect concubines, much like gladiators were trained to fight. There they learned obedience, charm, and beauty at the expense of their humanity. What does it do to a child to grow up in such a place? To be stripped of family, of identity, of any chance to understand love or freedom. The scars were permanent. This was the hidden Rome, an empire that prided itself on law, virtue, and civilization, yet built entire markets on the suffering of the most vulnerable. Behind every statue of marble was a boy in chains. Behind every golden villa was a life stolen.
The daily reality of life as a male concubine in Rome varied from household to household, but one truth remained constant. Nothing belonged to them. Not their time, not their choices, not even their own emotions. Their days were dictated entirely by their master's whims. For some, this meant being constantly present in the household, always within reach. They had to remain polished and composed, ready to smile or converse at a moment's notice. For others, their lives were more sporadic, ignored until they were suddenly summoned, then thrust into situations they could neither refuse nor control. This unpredictability created a constant state of tension. Imagine never knowing whether your next hour would be spent in silence, in humiliation, or in agony. And while some masters cloaked their exploitation in silk and honey, giving their concubines fine clothes and access to learning, others were far more direct. Many concubines lived in conditions no better than common slaves, confined to small quarters, stripped of privacy, and reminded daily that their value was limited to how well they could entertain. What made their plight particularly cruel was how completely they were excluded from Rome's legal and social systems. Roman law had layers of protections. Citizens had rights, certain slaves had specific rules governing their treatment. But concubines existed in a gray void. They weren't protected, nor were they even properly acknowledged. Their master's pleasure outweighed their existence. To complain would be useless. To resist would be suicidal. The psychological manipulation was relentless. Some masters gave small privileges only to yank them away, creating a cycle of confusion and dependency. A concubine might be rewarded one day with extra food, with jewelry, with words of praise, only for those same things to be stripped away the next day for some imagined offense. This pattern ensured that the boys lived in constant anxiety, never certain whether they were in favor or one misstep away from punishment. Worse still, isolation was a deliberate weapon. Many were forbidden from building friendships with others in the household, denied even the comfort of solidarity. When there were multiple concubines under one roof, they were often forced into competition. Who looked the best? Who pleased the master most? Who would be given privileges and who would be discarded? Instead of unity, rivalry was cultivated. Each boy's survival instinct became twisted into jealousy and fear. Education, too, was a double-edged sword. Some concubines learned to read and write, studied literature, or were trained in music and philosophy. But this wasn't to enrich them as human beings. It was to mold them into better companions. Men who could recite poetry at dinner, debate politics with charm, or sing and play music to entertain guests. Their talents existed not for their own growth, but as another form of service. And while their minds were being shaped, their bodies were meticulously controlled. Grooming rituals, exercise regimens, even cosmetic alterations were imposed on them to maintain a youthful and appealing appearance. Masters demanded they remain fresh, beautiful, and desirable. Some were even subjected to crude medical procedures to fit specific aesthetic ideals. These painful, sometimes dangerous practices were carried out with no concern for the concubine's suffering, only for the satisfaction of the one who owned him.
On the surface, they might look like ornaments of luxury, draped in silk, adorned with gold, paraded before guests like living trophies. But beneath this facade lay an unchanging truth. They had no freedom. Their bodies weren't their own. Their smiles weren't their own. Even their voices were often trained to reflect only what their master wanted to hear. Even when concubines traveled, which might appear glamorous, it was only another form of control. They were expected to accompany their masters on trips across the empire, from bustling Roman streets to far-off provinces. But they traveled not as companions, but as property, expected to perform the same services in every new location. It didn't matter whether they were in Rome, Greece, or Gaul. They carried their chains wherever they went. Within the household itself, their status was murky. To some slaves, concubines were pitied or despised, seen as shameful in their roles. To free family members, they were little more than diversions, objects to be spoken of or ignored depending on convenience. In truth, they belonged nowhere. Not slave, not citizen, not family, just something in between, suspended in a limbo of exploitation. The cruelty of their existence reached far beyond their own lives. When boys were taken as concubines, their families were often left in torment. Parents who had lost sons to conquest or the slave markets might never know what became of them. Some families, crushed under debt, were forced into impossible decisions, selling one child to save the rest. Imagine the burden of knowing your survival came at the cost of your child's freedom. For the boy, the knowledge that he had been bartered away must have weighed heavily with every passing day. A few tried to resist. Some concubines attempted escape, risking everything for even the slimmest hope of freedom. But when caught, the punishments were swift and brutal. Beatings, mutilations, public humiliations, all designed to send a message: resistance is futile. Others turned to the only escape left to them: suicide. But even that freedom was often denied. Masters, seeing their concubines as valuable property, took every measure to prevent them from ending their lives. They were guarded, watched, stripped of anything that could be used to harm themselves. Their suffering was not only lived, but prolonged. Religion offered no solace. Rome's gods promised protection, justice, and strength, but only for those considered worthy. Male concubines fell outside those divine boundaries, invisible in the eyes of the state gods. Some sought comfort in foreign cults or secret rituals, but even these were often forbidden by their masters. In every way possible, their lives were policed. Body, mind, spirit, nothing was untouched. The demand for concubines only fueled the cycle. Wealthy Romans competed to acquire the most beautiful, the most talented, the most exotic companions. This competition drove prices up and ensured the continuation of the trade. Boys were captured from distant lands, kidnapped, or sold by desperate families, all to feed Rome's insatiable appetite. This market grew so large that institutions emerged to prepare boys specifically for this fate. Like gladiators trained to fight, concubines were trained to serve. These schools taught not only physical upkeep, but psychological conditioning, breaking boys down until they could no longer imagine resistance. It was an industry of obedience, designed to strip them of identity and rebuild them into perfect objects of desire. For many, their fates were sealed before they were even old enough to understand what was happening. Children, barely past boyhood, suddenly thrust into a system designed to consume them. Their innocence was not lost, it was stolen, commodified, and sold. This was the hidden Rome, a society that worshipped law, honor, and civilization while allowing its elites to feast on the lives of the powerless. The marble arches and triumphal processions that we admire today were built in a world where boys were reduced to property. Rome's greatness came at a human cost, so staggering, so deeply buried, that only in whispers and fragments can we recover the voices of those who suffered. And those voices, faint though they are, tell us a truth. Rome's glory was never free. It was bought with the lives of the forgotten.
As terrible as their daily existence was, the fate of male concubines in Rome only grew more tragic with time. Unlike gladiators who might earn their freedom through victory, or certain slaves who could be manumitted after years of service, concubines had no such path. Their value was tied entirely to their youth and beauty, and once that faded, once their masters lost interest, they were often discarded like broken furniture. Some were sold into harsher forms of slavery, stripped of whatever fragile privileges they had once been given. Others were simply abandoned, left with no resources, no skills for survival outside the roles they had been forced to play. A few, in rare and exceptional cases, managed to reinvent themselves, hiding their pasts, finding new trades, or even earning a place in society. But these stories were the exceptions that proved the rule. For most, aging out of desirability meant a descent into obscurity, poverty, or worse. Medical care was another cruel irony. Masters would summon physicians not out of compassion, but to protect their investment. Cuts were treated, illnesses cured, bodies maintained, not for the concubine's own well-being, but so they could remain useful. Mental suffering, of course, was never addressed. Depression, trauma, despair, these weren't even acknowledged as real. Roman society accepted all of this without question. To them, honor, duty, and virtue were reserved for citizens of status. The suffering of concubines didn't count. Their pain didn't register. In public life, they were invisible, and in private life, they were consumed. It reveals something chilling about Rome, that a society capable of producing philosophy, law, and art of such sophistication could simultaneously normalize such cruelty. And yet, within this darkness, traces of resilience emerged. Some concubines developed survival strategies, becoming experts at reading moods, anticipating needs,
and navigating dangerous social dynamics. Others carved out small networks of support, using subtle gestures and secret codes to comfort each other. These tiny acts of humanity, though fragile, were defiant sparks in a world built to extinguish them. During festivals or grand banquets, concubines were often paraded as part of the entertainment. Dressed in elaborate costumes, forced to sing, dance, or perform for their master's guests, they became living ornaments of Rome's wealth. To outsiders, these spectacles may have seemed lavish, but for the concubines, they were humiliations, reminders that even in moments of splendor, they were still trapped.
The economic system that sustained this practice rippled far beyond the individual. Families torn apart, communities destabilized, cultures drained of their youth. All of it fed into Rome's hunger. Traders and kidnappers scoured the provinces, driven by the promise of gold. Wars weren't just about conquest. They were also about feeding Rome's appetite for human lives. Even archaeological evidence whispers of their existence. Objects found in Roman villas, chains, restraints, grooming tools, hint at the lives of those kept within. Literary references, too, appear in passing, cloaked in euphemism. Poets and historians might allude to companions or delicate youths, but rarely dared describe the darker reality. The silence itself is telling. Their stories were hidden because to acknowledge them too directly would mean confronting Rome's hypocrisy. And when concubines were transferred between masters, sold, gifted, or traded, the trauma repeated itself. Each transition meant new rules, new dangers, new humiliations. Even when they found relative stability with one master, that fragile world could be ripped away overnight. Their lives were like fragile glass, always on the verge of shattering. Yet, perhaps the greatest cruelty was the way Rome denied them the chance to be fully human. They were taught music, but not allowed to create for themselves. They were dressed in beauty, but stripped of dignity. They were given education, but forbidden to use it for freedom. Every gift came with chains attached. As they aged, the brutal reality set in. They had been trained not to survive as men, but only to exist as ornaments. And once that role ended, many had nothing left. The lucky few found scraps of independence. Most vanished from history, nameless, faceless, forgotten. Their suffering, however, left a mark. The normalization of their exploitation contributed to a broader culture of dehumanization that made Rome's cruelty possible on other scales, from gladiatorial arenas to the violent suppression of uprisings. A society that could reduce boys to objects could just as easily reduce entire peoples to slaves. The silence surrounding their stories for centuries is as damning as the system itself. We rarely read about them in history books because acknowledging their existence forces us to question the glory of Rome. But by bringing their voices back, even faintly, we begin to understand the full cost of empire.
Because behind every triumphal arch was a boy whose life had been stolen. Behind every law and marble forum was suffering buried out of sight. Rome's greatness came with a hidden price, a price paid by those who had no choice, no rights, and no voice. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of all. These forgotten concubines remind us that civilization's brilliance is often built on invisible cruelty, that the most dazzling achievements of power may rest on foundations of human suffering, and that progress, when unchecked by morality, comes at the expense of the most vulnerable. Their stories are not meant to simply horrify us. They are meant to remind us that exploitation thrives when it is normalized, when voices are silenced,
when the powerless are treated as invisible. 2,000 years later, we still grapple with the same questions. Who holds power? Who pays the price? And how often do we look away from the suffering hidden behind society's shining facades? The male concubines of Rome may never have been given the dignity of recognition in their lifetimes, but remembering them now is an act of defiance against the silence. It is a way of saying, you were here, you mattered, and your suffering will not be erased. Rome's marble may endure. Its roads may still run straight across Europe. Its laws may still shape the modern world. But its hidden cruelties must also be remembered. For only then can we understand the full story of what empire truly costs.